Blackmore Manor's ancient walls tell more than just a story. It's a tale that will leave you unsettled. A tale of a monstrous beast that only preys on trembling lives, but turns out to be nothing more than a deception. Yet, the true terror lay elsewhere: in untold death, murdered by a hand that belonged to someone close, and a battle fought for a more sinister purpose: wealth and power. Who among them used fear, conflict, and deceit as tools to claim what was never rightfully theirs? Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson are about to face the most dangerous game of their careers, but the terror lurking in the shadows will not only take them deep into the heart of the mystery, it will pull you into the abyss as well. It was the kind of morning that made even the most experienced detective feel a touch of unease. The fog that rolled down the narrow streets of London in October 1891 seemed to press against the windows of 221B Baker Street, wrapping the world outside in an oppressive silence. Sherlock Holmes, the world's most brilliant detective, sat by the fireplace, his keen eyes tracing the swirling mist, yet seemingly lost in thought. His violin, a tool for his moments of contemplation, lay untouched on the table, an unusual sight. Dr. John Watson, ever the loyal companion, sat opposite him. He could not help but notice the restlessness in his friend's demeanor. It was a lull between cases, and Holmes seemed to be fighting the monotony of idle time. Then, as if by fate, the spell was broken by the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps on the stairs. Mrs. Hudson entered, her usual calm replaced with a touch of urgency. She placed an envelope on the table, sealed with an elaborate crest, and her eyes gleamed with curiosity. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice tinged with something Holmes couldn't quite place. Holmes took the letter, breaking the seal with a precision that suggested he'd handled many such missives in his time. His eyes scanned the contents quickly, and his usual detached demeanor shifted into one of keen interest. "This," he said, handing the letter to Watson, "is most intriguing." Watson leaned forward, reading aloud the words that would pull them into a case unlike any they had encountered before. "Mr. Holmes, I write to you in utter desperation. My son, Edward Blackmore, has met an untimely death under circumstances most distressing. The local authorities insist it was an accident, but whispers of a family curse and a ghostly beast haunt the manor. I implore you to come to Blackmore Manor and uncover the truth before more tragedy befalls us. Yours faithfully, Lady Margaret Blackmore." Watson set the letter down, his brow furrowing. "A curse, you say? Surely you don't give credence to such tales." Holmes, as always, was quick with a response. He lit his pipe, the faint glow of the tobacco reflecting in his calculating eyes. "Of course not. But a young nobleman's sudden death, shrouded in mystery and accompanied by whispers of the supernatural. That, Watson, is a different matter entirely. No, this is no ordinary case. A visit to Blackmore Manor will provide answers, and I believe the truth is far more elaborate than some simple superstition." Within hours, Holmes and Watson were on a train bound for the English countryside. The landscape outside the window grew darker, the mist thickening as they ventured farther from London. The rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels only amplified the eerie stillness that seemed to consume the countryside. Despite the beauty of the rolling hills and desolate moors, a palpable sense of dread hung in the air, an unspoken warning that something was terribly wrong. When they arrived at the village of Blackmore, they were greeted by a silent coachman named Thomas, a servant of the Blackmore estate. His gaunt face betrayed an unsettling fear, and his eyes darted around nervously as he ushered them into the coach. "It's good you've come, Mr. Holmes," Thomas said, his voice low. "The man's in a dreadful state. People around here say the curse is real. After what happened to Lord Edward, even I'm not so sure anymore." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Superstition, my good man, is often the weapon of those who wish to deceive." As they made their way through the misty moors, Thomas recounted the tragic tale of the so-called curse that had plagued the Blackmore family for centuries. "They say the Blackmore family wronged someone long ago, so wronged that they summoned a beast to haunt them. At night, you can hear it howling, and those who see it rarely live to tell the tale." Holmes remained silent for a moment, his mind whirring with possibilities. Convenient, isn't it? A tale spun to cloak a deeper truth. Soon, the imposing silhouette of Blackmore Manor appeared through the fog, a sprawling estate of gray stone, its ancient walls weathered by time and torment. The windows loomed like hollow eyes, watching over the land, as if guarding its dark secrets. Lady Margaret Blackmore, her face pale and drawn with grief, greeted them at the entrance. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her posture weary from the weight of her family's tragic history. "Mr. Holmes, thank you for coming. I fear for my family. Edward's death, it was no accident." Her voice trembled, but it was clear she believed every word of her own conviction. Holmes gave a curt nod, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Tell me everything, Lady Blackmore. Every detail. It is, after all, the details that will unravel this mystery." "I am certain of it," Lady Margaret insisted, her voice shaking. "It was no accident." Her eyes darted nervously around the room as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. "Please, Mr. Holmes, you must uncover the truth." Holmes inclined his head politely. "Rest assured, Lady Blackmore, we shall uncover the truth." His tone was calm, reassuring, yet his sharp mind had already begun to analyze the situation. Inside Blackmore Manor, the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily. Once a grand estate, the manor now appeared shrouded in shadows, as though the house itself mourned the lost lives it had witnessed over the centuries. The echoes of past whispers seemed to seep from the very stones, murmuring of betrayal and tragedy. Lady Margaret led them to the study, her every step tinged with grief. It was here that she recounted the final moments of her son, Edward. "He was found at the edge of the moor," she began, her voice faltering. "His body mangled beyond recognition. The villagers said it was an animal attack, but there were footprints." Holmes's interest peaked at the mention of the footprints. "You say the footprints were not natural." "They are still there," Lady Margaret replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But no one dares go near the spot. They say the curse. It's true." "Excellent," Holmes said, a gleam of anticipation lighting up his eyes. "Watson, we have our starting point." He rose, his mind already racing ahead to the mysteries that lay in wait. As the clock struck midnight, Holmes and Watson prepared to brave the moors. Unbeknownst to them, the darkness would not only conceal the dangers of the land, but also reveal secrets far more perilous than either could have anticipated. The shadow of Blackmore Manor had only just begun to reveal its hidden terrors. Whispers of the beast. The morning dawned gray and heavy, with a mist that clung stubbornly to the moors, refusing to lift even as the sun struggled to pierce the overcast sky. The chill in the air was palpable, as if the very landscape itself was steeped in sorrow. Inside Blackmore Manor, the mood was no less oppressive. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson were readying themselves for their first investigation into the mystery of Edward Blackmore's death. Holmes, ever meticulous, donned his sturdy boots and secured his walking stick, his every movement deliberate. Watson, though more accustomed to the dangers of the battlefield than the eerie unknown, was armed with his revolver, his nerves sharpened by the ominous reputation that surrounded the moors. Both men knew that superstition ruled this land, and that reason alone might not be enough to unravel its secrets. As they made their way to the dining room, they were met by Lady Margaret, her hands trembling as she poured tea. Her face was drawn with grief, but there was something more in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or the weight of a long-held secret. "Mr. Holmes," she began hesitantly, her voice barely audible, "before you go to the moors, there is something you should know. The curse of Blackmore is not merely an idle tale." Holmes raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the sudden shift in tone. "Go on." Lady Margaret took a deep breath before continuing. "Generations ago, my ancestor, Sir Lionel Blackmore, wronged an innocent man. In his dying breath, this man cursed our family. Since then, the beast has haunted us." "A beast?" Watson asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "What sort of beast are we talking about?" Lady Margaret swallowed nervously, her eyes darting around the room as though the very mention of it could summon the creature. "They say it is large, far larger than any ordinary animal, with glowing eyes and claws like scythes. Its howls are said to freeze the blood of anyone who hears them. It hunts the Blackmore family, one by one. And now it has claimed Edward. Holmes's sharp mind absorbed every word, but his expression remained unreadable. Fascinating, he remarked dryly. And yet, I suspect these tales serve a more insidious purpose. Fear, after all, is a powerful weapon. Before Lady Margaret could respond, the door creaked open, and a wiry young man entered. He was dressed in mourning, yet there was an air of cold detachment about him that seemed at odds with the somber surroundings. "This is Henry Blackmore," Lady Margaret explained, her voice tight. "My late son's cousin. He's been staying here since Edward's death." Henry extended a hand to Holmes and Watson. His grip was firm, but there was a flicker in his eye, something Holmes did not miss. "I'm grateful you've come," Henry said, his voice tinged with something darker. "The moors are no place for reason. Superstition rules here. Even I've heard the howls at night." Holmes studied him closely. "Have you now?" His eyes narrowed slightly, his mind already calculating. "Tell me, Henry, were you close to Edward?" For a moment Henry's face darkened. A flicker of something resentment perhaps crossed his features before he masked it with a neutral expression. "We were family, Mr. Holmes. That is all I will say." Holmes said no more, though Watson noticed the subtle change in his friend's expression. Holmes was like a hound on a scent, but something about Henry Blackmore seemed to have piqued his curiosity. Watson made a mental note of it but said nothing. The time had come to leave the manor and head toward the moors. The atmosphere outside was thick with fog, the land both beautiful and treacherous. As they approached the location where Edward's body had been found, Thomas, the coachman, hesitated. His usually steady hand trembled as he pulled the reins of the carriage to a stop. "I'll go no farther, sir," Thomas said, his voice low, filled with dread. "This place is cursed. I've seen too much to doubt it." Holmes's gaze hardened. "Wait here, then. Watson and I will investigate." The moors stretched before them, an endless expanse of uneven ground and hidden pools of water. The fog rolled over the land like a living thing, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. Holmes and Watson stepped into the mist, their every sense heightened. They were no longer just pursuing a case, they were walking into a web of secrets that threatened to ensnare them both. As they moved deeper into the moors, Watson's unease grew. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant howls that seemed to echo from all directions. It was then, in the heart of the moor, that they saw at the first of many clues that would begin to unravel the mystery of Blackmore Manor. Edward's death had left its mark on the moor, but not in the way most would expect. The place where his body had been found was marked by a crude wooden cross, hastily planted into the earth, its rough edges a stark contrast to the grandeur of the Blackmore name. Around it, the soil was churned up, as though a great struggle had taken place. Yet, despite the disturbed ground, there was something eerily controlled about the scene. Holmes crouched, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the soil with the focus of a hawk. "Here," he muttered, pointing to a set of tracks that had been left in the mud. Watson leaned in closer, his frown deepening. "Those are unusual," he remarked, his voice tinged with confusion. "Too large for a dog, but not quite human." "Precisely," Holmes said, his voice cool as always. He stood, his tall figure casting a long shadow over the moor. "And yet, they bear the marks of artifice. Note the uniform depth and shape. These were manufactured, not natural." His gaze swept over the tracks again, his mind whirring with possibilities. "Someone has gone to great lengths to fabricate the illusion of a beast," he continued, his voice laced with the thrill of discovery. "But why?" Holmes then produced a magnifying glass, turning it in his fingers, as though it were a tool of unparalleled importance. He bent down and examined a nearby thorn bush with laser focus. Watson, ever the dutiful companion, watched as his friend moved with fluid precision. "There," Holmes said, his voice low but sharp. His fingers brushed aside the thorns, revealing a torn piece of cloth caught in the brambles. He held it up for Watson to see. "This," he said, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a crucial clue, "is from a cloak or coat. It likely belongs to our perpetrator." Watson blinked in surprise, but before he could comment, Holmes's attention was drawn to something half buried in the dirt. With a swift motion, he retrieved the object, small, delicate, a locket. He turned it over, examining the engraving on the back. "E.B.," he said quietly, as though speaking to himself. "Edward Blackmore." Watson's heart skipped a beat. "Are you sure it's his?" "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied, pocketing the locket with a sense of finality. "But the question remains, why was it left here? A careless error or a deliberate misdirection?" The faint sound of a distant howl interrupted the moment. It was primal, chilling, a sound that sent a shiver down Watson's spine, though Holmes remained unfazed. "Ah," Holmes said, standing upright with his usual calm demeanor. "The howls. An interesting addition to our mystery. But they are likely another piece of this elaborate ruse, nothing more than a clever device to terrify and mislead." Watson glanced around, unease prickling at the back of his neck. "Holmes," he said, his voice low, "these Moors could hide anything or anyone. If this is a human scheme, they may still be watching us." "Then let them watch," Holmes replied, his tone cool as ice. "They will soon learn that fear is no match for reason." With that, the two men made their way back to the manor. Holmes's mind was racing with the new evidence. The oversized tracks, the torn fabric, the locket, each a piece of the puzzle, but not yet the full picture. There was something more to this than met the eye. Yet one thing troubled Holmes: the precision of the plan. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to create a believable beast, they were orchestrating a performance, one designed to drive the Blackmore family, and anyone who dared to investigate, into a frenzy of superstition. But why? What was the endgame? That night, as Holmes and Watson sat in their room at the manor, a blood-curdling howl echoed through the corridors, reverberating off the stone walls. It was so close, so primal, that it felt as though the creature itself were right outside the door. Holmes glanced at Watson, his expression unreadable. "Our adversary is bold, Watson," he said, his voice cutting through the tension in the air. "But overconfidence is a weakness." Watson's eyes narrowed. His heart was racing, the sound of the howl still ringing in his ears. Yet he trusted Holmes with his very life. "What do we do now?" Holmes's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Tomorrow, we set a trap." Into the mist. The next morning, the air around Blackmore Manor was thick with fog. It seemed to seep into the very stone walls, a suffocating presence that obscured everything beyond a few feet. The moors were hidden beneath a shroud of mist so dense that it felt as though the world itself had disappeared. Holmes, ever the methodical investigator, packed a few essentials: a magnifying glass, a sturdy rope, and a small notebook. Each item was selected with deliberate care, as though every detail mattered in the grand design of his plans. Watson, less assured of what they might encounter, tucked his revolver into his coat pocket, his fingers brushing the cold metal. The sensation was a reminder of the danger they might face in the coming hours. As they descended to the manor's main hall, Lady Margaret was waiting for them, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea. Her gaze flickered between them, a clear reflection of the worry gnawing at her insides. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice soft but urgent, "you'll be careful, won't you? The moors are treacherous, and the beast is said to be most active in the early morning hours. There are rumors that no one who has ventured there has ever returned unharmed." Holmes gave a calm nod, his face as composed as ever. "Rest assured, Lady Blackmore, we are prepared for all manner of danger." His voice was steady, resolute. "The truth does not fear the dark." As he spoke, Watson couldn't help but feel the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. The moors were no place for reason, and as much as Holmes believed in logic, there was something about the land that defied explanation. But Watson clung to the hope that with Holmes at his side, they would uncover the truth before it was too late. Henry entered the hall, his face pale, yet there was an edge of resolve in his demeanor that had been absent the day before. His steps were purposeful, and though his eyes betrayed a lingering anxiety, his voice carried a sense of determination. "I'll accompany you," he announced, his words slightly shaky but his resolve undeniable. "I know these moors better than anyone. You'll need someone who understands their dangers." Holmes studied him for a moment, his sharp gaze taking in every nuance, the slight tremor in Henry's hands, the subtle tightness in his jaw, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. After a beat, Holmes nodded. "Very well," he said, his voice calm, but there was a glimmer of something calculating in his eyes. "Your familiarity with the terrain may prove useful." The trio set out in the dim light of early morning, the fog thickening as they ventured deeper into the moors. Watson's senses were on high alert. The moors stretched endlessly before them, an inhospitable labyrinth of mist, uneven ground, and shadowy shapes that seemed to shift as if alive. The quiet was oppressive, broken only by the distant, haunting call of a bird or the occasional squelch of boots sinking into the damp earth. Holmes, however, was invigorated by the desolate landscape. His eyes glinted with a sharp intensity as he scanned every patch of ground, his magnifying glass catching fragments of light through the swirling fog. His every step was purposeful, every glance a calculated move. "Observe, Watson," he said, his voice low and steady, yet tinged with excitement. He pointed to a trail of faint impressions in the mud, a trail that ran parallel to their own path. "These tracks are consistent with the ones we found near Edward's body. Note their direction away from the manor." Watson leaned forward, his brow furrowing in thought. "You think the beast or whoever's behind this fled the scene?" he asked, his voice edged with skepticism. "Possibly," Holmes replied, crouching down to inspect the prints more closely. He traced their edges with the tip of his finger, his mind working through the details. "But what strikes me as curious is their uniformity. Each step is identical in depth and spacing. This is no animal's erratic movement. It's too precise, too deliberate." Watson felt a flicker of unease at the implications. A mechanical aid, perhaps. Holmes nodded, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "Perhaps, Watson, perhaps." As they continued to move deeper into the mist, Watson couldn't shake the oppressive feeling that seemed to settle in his chest. The landscape felt like a trap, as if the moors themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. He turned to Henry, his unease growing. "Holmes," Watson said, his voice quieter now, "if these tracks are fabricated, where does the real culprit hide? Surely they'd need a vantage point to observe you or their intended victim." Holmes's gaze shifted eastward, to the higher ridges that loomed in the distance like silent sentinels. His finger traced the contours of the land, his mind calculating possibilities with uncanny precision. "Look to the east, Watson," Holmes said, his tone cool but commanding. "Those ridges would provide an excellent vantage point to observe the manor and the surrounding land. Whoever is behind this would need such a view." Henry shifted uncomfortably at the mention of the ridges. His eyes darted nervously toward the horizon. "The eastern ridge is dangerous," he said, his voice laced with hesitation. "There are sinkholes and bogs that can swallow a man whole. I wouldn't advise going there." Holmes caught the hesitation in Henry's voice, his sharp mind immediately honing in on the subtext. "You seem quite familiar with the hazards of the moors, Mr. Blackmore," he said, his voice soft but probing. "Tell me, have you explored them often?" Henry's gaze dropped to the ground, avoiding Holmes's sharp eyes. His jaw tightened. "It's hard not to, living here all my life," he muttered. "But anyone with sense avoids venturing too far. It's not just the terrain," he added quickly, as if trying to change the subject. "There are things out here, things best left undisturbed." Before Holmes could respond, a low, mournful howl echoed through the mist, rising from the depths of the moors. It was a sound so primal, so unearthly, that it sent a jolt of fear through Watson's chest. His hand instinctively went to the revolver tucked inside his coat, his fingers gripping the cold metal. The howl rose and fell, like a mournful lament carried on the wind. There was a rhythm to it too precise, too deliberate to be natural. Watson felt his pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. Holmes remained still, his face impassive as he listened to the sound. His eyes were sharp, focused on the horizon. "Fascinating," he murmured, his voice calm, though his mind was already racing. A whisper, perhaps, or some mechanical contraption mimicking a wolf's howl. The intervals are too precise to be natural. Henry looked alarmed, his face paling as the howl seemed to draw nearer. "You're saying it's a trick. But why? What's the purpose?" "To instill fear," Holmes replied simply, his voice sharp and certain. "Fear clouds judgment and makes the supernatural seem plausible. The question, of course, is who benefits from such terror." Another howl split the air, this one closer, its haunting sound reverberating in the stillness of the moors. Watson scanned the horizon, his pulse quickening with every passing moment. "Holmes," he said, his voice tight with tension, "whatever it is, it's moving toward us." Holmes straightened, his expression calm but focused, the flicker of danger in his eyes. "Then, let us meet it." The sound of rustling grass reached them before the figure emerged, a hulking shape, massive and shadowed, that loomed out of the fog. Its glowing eyes gleamed with a predatory light, and its ghastly snarl sent a shock of cold through Watson's veins. Watson's breath caught in his throat, his hand tightening on the revolver. He raised it, his heart hammering in his chest, but before he could pull the trigger, Holmes's hand shot out, grabbing his arm. "Wait," Holmes hissed, his voice low and urgent. "It's not what you think." Secrets beneath the manor. The evening at Blackmore Manor was stifling, a sense of unease thick in the air, as though the very walls of the manor itself were holding their breath. Sherlock Holmes, Dr. Watson, and Henry Blackmore returned from their harrowing encounter with the creature on the moors. Their boots were caked with the damp earth of the wilderness, their minds heavy with the mystery they had just begun to unravel. The fog outside seemed to press closer to the manor, its suffocating presence mirroring the tension that hung between them. Watson, his thoughts still a whirl of confusion and apprehension, retired to their shared quarters to clean up, his mind trying to make sense of the bizarre and chilling encounter. Meanwhile, Holmes, ever the pragmatist, sought a private audience with Lady Margaret Blackmore. The drawing room, bathed in the faint flickering glow of the fireplace, was bathed in shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe in the dim light. Lady Margaret sat near the hearth, her posture rigid, her hands nervously clutching a faded photograph of Edward Blackmore. Holmes took a seat across from her, his eyes unwavering and calm, yet a subtle intensity lingered in his expression. "Lady Blackmore," he began, his voice steady but firm, "it is imperative that you tell me everything you know about the history of your family and this so-called curse. Spare me no detail, no matter how trivial it may seem." Lady Margaret hesitated, her fingers tightening around the photograph. The words hung in the air like a weight, unspoken yet palpable. Finally, she exhaled a long breath, her voice breaking the silence, thick with years of sorrow. "Very well, Mr. Holmes," she said, her eyes downcast. "The Blackmores have lived here for generations, but ours is a history marred by tragedy. It is said that centuries ago, my ancestor, Sir Lionel Blackmore, cheated a trusted ally out of his land. The man, heartbroken and betrayed, cursed him, vowed that his descendants would be haunted by a beast of vengeance." Holmes leaned forward, the flickering light casting shadows across his sharp features. His eyes gleamed with a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. "Curious," he murmured. "This legend, I suspect it has been deliberately perpetuated, but by whom and to what end remains to be seen." Lady Margaret's breath caught as she continued, her voice trembling now, laden with an undercurrent of fear. "There is more, Mr. Holmes." She paused, collecting her thoughts, as if each word was a painful admission. "Edward Mason confided in me shortly before his death that he had found something hidden beneath the manor. He refused to explain what it was, but he was terrified. He spoke of shadows, whispers, betrayal." Holmes's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. "Beneath the manor," he repeated, his mind already racing through the implications. He shifted in his seat, his posture becoming more intense. And yet, no mention of this discovery was made to anyone else. Lady Margaret nodded, her lips quivering. "I begged him to tell me more, But he insisted, he was adamant, that I should not involve myself in whatever it was. And then, her voice broke, the weight of the memory too much to bear. Then he was gone. Holmes stood abruptly, his mind already shifting gears. He could see the larger picture coming together now, the threads of the mystery interweaving with a grim clarity. His gaze met Lady Margaret's, unwavering and sharp. "Thank you, Lady Blackmore. You have been most helpful." His words were clipped, efficient, but there was an unmistakable intensity beneath them. He turned on his heel, his mind ablaze with the next steps in their investigation. As Holmes left the drawing room, his thoughts raced. Beneath the manor, Edward had found something hidden away in the depths of Blackmore Manor itself. Whatever it was, it held the key to unlocking the terrifying mystery that had been unfolding on the moors. Meanwhile, Watson had returned to his room, the sound of the wind howling outside the window setting his nerves on edge. He couldn't shake the images of the beast, the unnatural creature with glowing eyes, its movements jerky and mechanical, like a puppet on strings. But Holmes had been quick to dismiss it, explaining it as nothing more than a clever ruse, a contraption designed to instill fear. Fear was the weapon, the tool the true antagonist wielded to hide in plain sight. But who, Watson wondered, was behind this twisted game? As Holmes stood in the hallway, preparing to descend into the depths of the manor once more, a dark thought gnawed at him. He had been through many mysteries, many tricks, many deceptions, but something about this one felt different, darker, more elusive. Even he could feel it now, a creeping sense of dread that crawled beneath his skin, whispering that this case might hold dangers far beyond his calculations. As the clock on the wall ticked relentlessly on, the night deepened around Blackmore Manor. The fog outside thickened, curling like tendrils against the stone walls. The secrets beneath the manor stirred in the silence, waiting to be uncovered. The beast revealed. The evening in Blackmore Manor felt as though the very air was thick with anticipation, the weight of unsolved mysteries pressing down on everyone in the room. Holmes stood at the head of the long, dark wood dining table in the grand hall, the flickering candlelight casting long, wavering shadows that danced ominously along the stone walls. Each shadow seemed to hold a secret, as if the manor itself were whispering things it wished to remain hidden. The people gathered around him. Lady Margaret, Henry Blackmore, the housekeeper Mrs. Given, and the remaining servants sat with tense faces, their nerves stretched thin. Watson stood beside Holmes, his own heart racing with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. The revolver tucked under his jacket was a silent reminder of the danger that lingered just beneath the surface of this mystery. Holmes's sharp, calculating gaze moved over the assembled faces, reading their fear, their disbelief, and perhaps, for some, a quiet hope that tonight would be the night they would finally understand the terror that had haunted them all. Holmes broke the silence with a voice that was calm, yet unwaveringly confident. "Tonight," he began, his words measured but heavy with meaning, "we shall bring this mystery to its conclusion. The so-called beast of Blackmore is no specter, no creature of myth, nor is it a curse laid upon this family by some vengeful ancestor. No, it is a creation, a carefully crafted deception, designed not only to terrify, but to destroy." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Lady Margaret's face had gone pale, her hand trembling slightly on the armrest of her chair. Henry Blackmore, who had been holding his breath, shifted uneasily in his seat, his eyes darting nervously between Holmes and the others. Mrs. Given's eyes were wide with confusion and fear, while the servants exchanged uneasy glances. "Mr. Holmes, surely you can't mean—" Lady Margaret's voice faltered, but she quickly regained her composure. "You can't be suggesting that the beast we've seen is just a man in disguise." Holmes's gaze hardened, and he stepped forward, leaning against the table with his hands folded in front of him. His expression was a mask of cold determination. "Exactly, Lady Blackmore. A manor, rather, a group of men, using advanced technology and machinery to mimic the appearance of the legendary beast. This creature," Holmes continued, his tone gaining intensity, "is not the product of dark forces or some ancient curse. It is the result of human hands, working in secret." The room was silent now, save for the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth. Holmes paused for a moment, allowing his words to settle in the air. The implications of his theory were staggering. If this was true, then the true culprit was not some unseen monster stalking the moors, but someone within the manor, someone who had used fear and deception to control everyone around them. But why? Watson asked, his voice quiet but filled with disbelief. Why go to such lengths? Why create such a spectacle? Holmes's eyes flickered, and for a moment he appeared lost in thought. The answer, Watson, lies in the very foundation of this manor, the history of the Blackmore family. The curse, the beast, the fear, it's all been orchestrated for a reason. Someone within these walls stands to gain from the terror they have created. He turned his gaze to Henry Blackmore, his piercing eyes not missing the subtle twitch in his posture. Mr. Blackmore, I suspect you know more than you have let on. Henry's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak but faltered, as if the weight of the truth was too heavy to bear. I don't know what you mean, he said, his voice strained. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he took a slow step forward, his voice cold as ice. You've been hiding something. I've seen it in your eyes. The fear, the guilt, the shame. A thick silence followed his words, as everyone in the room awaited Henry's response. The tension was palpable, and for a moment, it seemed as if time itself had frozen. Finally, Henry exhaled sharply, his shoulders sagging as if he could no longer carry the burden of his secrets. You're right, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. I know who is behind the beast. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Tell us then, who? Henry's face contorted with a mix of anger and regret. He stood up, pacing in the dim light. It's not just one person, Mr. Holmes. It's a network of conspirators. People who have been hiding in the shadows for years. They've used the legend of the Blackmore curse to manipulate us all, first my ancestors, then my family, and now me. Holmes took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Henry. You know who they are? Yes, Henry said, his voice hoarse. And it's not just about the curse. There's something more, something beneath the manor that they're hiding. A treasure. A secret that has been buried for centuries. The room seemed to hold its breath as the truth began to unravel. Holmes's mind raced, connecting the dots. A secret treasure, a hidden history. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but there was still one more question that lingered in the air like a dark cloud. What happens now? Watson asked, his voice tight with urgency. What will they do when they realize we've uncovered the truth? Holmes turned toward the door, his face set in grim determination. Now, Watson, the hunt begins in earnest. Tomorrow, we will descend into the depths of Blackmore Manor and uncover the truth once and for all. Whoever is behind this conspiracy will learn that there is no hiding from Sherlock Holmes. The culprit unmasked. A chilling murmur rippled through the room as the full weight of Holmes's revelation began to sink in. The faces around the table hardened with disbelief, yet the truth was undeniable. Henry Blackmore shifted uneasily in his chair, his eyes flicking toward the door as though hoping to escape, but his movements betrayed him. Lady Margaret, sitting at the far end of the table, looked both relieved and terrified at once, her hand clutching the armrest as though it might anchor her to some semblance of reality. The terror in her eyes was not the fear of the beast, but the possibility that the killer was sitting just feet away from her. You believe someone here killed my son? Lady Margaret asked, her voice trembling as though every word weighed down with years of grief and fear. The question hung in the air, unanswered for a moment, as everyone turned to Holmes for the truth they dreaded to hear. Precisely, Holmes replied, his voice as cold and steady as the grave. And in doing so, they sought to perpetuate the legend of the Blackmore beast, conceal their true motives. I have already uncovered the tools used to fabricate the creature hidden beneath this very manor. Mrs. Given, the housekeeper, gasped, clutching a rosary in her trembling hands. I told you this place was cursed, she muttered, as if the weight of her superstitions had been vindicated by Holmes's words. Not cursed, madam, Holmes corrected, with a faint but telling smile. But cursed with greed and cunning. Someone here has engineered the beastly costume, the mechanical howls, and the monstrous footprints to terrify and mislead. My investigation revealed the use of a clever chemical compound to create the glowing eyes of the beast, and modified footwear to craft the footprints we saw on the moors. Henry Blackmore's face reddened, and he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "That's preposterous," he shouted, his voice rising in indignation. "Why would anyone go to such lengths? What could they possibly gain?" Holmes fixed him with a steely, unblinking stare. The tension between them crackled, electric and unyielding. "What indeed?" Holmes asked coolly. "The answer lies in inheritance, Mr. Blackmore. Lord Edward was the rightful heir to the family fortune and the manor. His death leaves you next in line, does it not?" The room fell deathly silent. Lady Margaret's eyes flickered to Henry, a faint gasp escaping her lips, as the truth of the accusation struck her like a blow. The heavy silence stretched on, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire. Henry's face drained of color, but he laughed nervously, as if to dismiss the accusation. "You think I killed Edward," he said with a hollow chuckle. "That's absurd. I've lived here my whole life. Why would I harm my own cousin for wealth and power?" Holmes's response was swift, his words cutting through the air like a blade. "Your guilt is not proven by motive alone, Mr. Blackmore. There is evidence." Holmes reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the torn fabric he had recovered earlier, then pulled out a small objectin-engraved locket. "This locket, found near Edward's body, does not belong to him. It belongs to you." The engraving read, E.B. Edward Blackmore's initials. Henry's hands twitched, his face suddenly drained of all pretense. Holmes continued, his voice ice-cold. "And this fabric," he said, holding up the torn cloth, "matches the cloak you were seen wearing the night of Edward's death. You dropped it in your haste to stage the scene. This was not a random act. It was calculated." Henry's laughter ceased abruptly, replaced by a stone-cold silence. He staggered backward, his mind racing for a way out, but it was too late. Holmes's next words were the final blow. "Your scheme was clever, but you underestimated me." Holmes's tone turned grim. "When Watson and I ventured into the moors last night, we encountered your beast, a mechanical contraption disguised as a monstrous creature, operated by you, to keep suspicion away from yourself." Henry's composure shattered, his face contorting with panic. "You have no proof I was there," he shouted, his voice rising in desperation. Holmes raised his hand, silencing him with a gesture that was both commanding and final. "On the contrary, I do," Holmes said with an unwavering calm. "After our encounter, I recovered traces of the same chemical used to make the glowing eyes of the beast, traces that lead directly to the workshop beneath this manor, where I found tools marked with your initials." The words seemed to pierce through the room like a sword, and Lady Margaret's face turned ashen. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "Henry, is this true? Did you kill Edward?" Henry's shoulders slumped under the weight of his guilt. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. "I had no choice," he blurted out, his voice trembling with the confession he had tried so hard to suppress. "Edward planned to sell the manor, squander our legacy. I had to protect what was rightfully ours." Holmes's voice was sharp, cutting through Henry's frantic excuses. "Protect it by committing murder. You sought to gain the estate through deceit and terror, but your actions have undone you." The room seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, time stood still as the weight of Henry's confession settled over them all. But before anything further could be said, the door to the dining hall burst open with a sudden crash, and 2 constables entered, summoned by a message Holmes had sent earlier in the day. Henry's face twisted in panic. He took a step toward the door, but Watson was already there, his revolver drawn and aimed directly at Henry. "Not so fast, Mr. Blackmore," Watson said, his voice cold and resolute. Henry attempted to flee, but the constables quickly restrained him. His protests echoed down the corridor as he was dragged away, his face twisted in anger and fear. But it was too late. His fate was sealed. With Henry gone, the room fell into an eerie silence. Lady Margaret sat motionless, her hands trembling in her lap. Mrs. Given still clutched her rosary, but the curse she had believed in so fervently had been replaced by the stark reality of greed, betrayal, and murder. Holmes turned to Watson, his eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction. "The game is over, Watson. The beast has been unmasked, and the true face of the killer revealed." As the constables escorted Henry out of the manor, a heavy silence filled the room. It was over. The mystery had been solved. But the darkness of Blackmore Manor would linger in their minds, its secrets finally brought to light. The echoes of Blackmore. It was only when the carriage passed a solitary figure, walking slowly across the moors, that Holmes stirred from his thoughts. His eyes narrowed, and he gestured sharply toward the driver. "Stop the carriage," he called out, his tone decisive. The driver, who had learned to obey Holmes without question, immediately pulled the reins and brought the horses to a halt. Holmes stepped out, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground as he moved toward the figure. The man was old, bent with age and experience, his face weathered by decades spent under the harsh winds of the moors. His eyes, however, were sharp and piercing, betraying a keen awareness of his surroundings. He carried a bundle of firewood, the weight of it resting heavily on his stooped back, and leaned on a walking stick with every step. He barely acknowledged Holmes's approach, his gaze distant, as though the land itself had long ago taught him not to be surprised by visitors. "Good day to you, sir," Holmes said, offering the man a polite nod. "Might I have a word?" The man eyed him warily, his eyes narrowing as if to judge Holmes's intentions. After a long pause, he gave a short grunt. "Aye, if you've a reason," he replied, his voice rough with age. Holmes gestured to the vast, desolate moors that stretched around them, the cold winds sweeping across the barren land. "You've lived here a long time, I take it. Tell me, have you ever seen or heard anything out of the ordinary on these moors? Something others might call supernatural?" At the mention of the beast, the old man's expression darkened. His lips curled in disgust as he spat onto the earth, his voice dripping with disdain. "The beast, eh? A tale to scare children and fools. But there's truth in the land itself." He paused, glancing over his shoulder toward the distant hills, as if listening to a voice only he could hear. "These moors," he continued, his voice softer now, "they have a way of keeping secrets. I've heard things, howls, whispers in the night, sounds that don't belong. But the beast? A number I've seen no beast." Holmes regarded him thoughtfully, his piercing gaze never leaving the man. "And what do you believe?" The man shrugged, his face unreadable. "I believe the moors are what they are, wild, untamed, and full of things we don't understand. Not everything needs an explanation, sir. Some things are better left to the land." Holmes nodded, acknowledging the man's words, though his expression remained inscrutable. "Thank you for your time," Holmes said, his tone polite but firm. He turned and walked back toward the carriage, his steps quick and purposeful. The old man watched him go, his eyes narrowing as if he had just shared a secret that weighed more than a lifetime of silence. Once back in the carriage, Holmes's face was unreadable, though his thoughts clearly lingered on the old man's words. The carriage resumed its journey, the wheels creaking against the rutted road, but the stillness between Holmes and Watson was thick with unspoken questions. Later, back in the comfort of their London office, Watson sat at his desk, quill in hand, reflecting on the case as he wrote the final lines of his account. The mystery of Blackmore Manor had been solved, its culprit unmasked, the beast revealed for the mechanical farce it truly was, and the criminal brought to justice. But something about it still gnawed at him, like an itch that couldn't quite be scratched. The moors, with their haunting cries and shifting mists, seemed to linger in his mind, defying the rational clarity Holmes so often prided himself on. Even in the light of day, they held a strange, unshakable presence that made the world outside feel distant, almost unreal. He glanced up from his writing, his gaze finding Holmes, who sat by the window, gazing out at the bustling city with an air of quiet contemplation. The soft glow of the gas lamps cast long shadows across his face, deepening the lines of thought that had become so familiar to Watson over the years. "Holmes, Watson began, breaking the silence that had settled in the room. Do you ever wonder if we truly solved the case, or if the moors still hold secrets we missed? Holmes turned slowly, his gaze meeting Watson's. A faint smile tugged at his lips, but it was one of those smiles that spoke not of joy but of something far more elusive perhaps, a quiet acknowledgement of something unknown. The beauty of the unknown, Watson, Holmes replied, his voice soft, almost reverential, is that it humbles even the keenest mind. Perhaps the moors hold their secrets still, or perhaps in solving this case, we uncovered more than we intended to. He leaned back slightly, his fingers lightly tapping the stem of his pipe. Either way, the world spins on, and we move to the next mystery. Watson watched his friend, the words settling in his mind like dust. The ease with which Holmes dismissed the uncertainties was both a comfort and a source of frustration. But perhaps that was the essence of Holmes. He found peace in the unanswered questions, the mysteries that hung in the air like smoke, just out of reach. Satisfied with the response, Watson turned back to his writing, though his mind wandered. The howls of the moors echoed in his memory, that strange, unsettling sound that had followed them even after the case was closed. The mystery of Blackmore Manor had been solved, or had it? For Holmes, the case was done. But for Watson, the shadow of Blackmore Manor and its eerie moors lingered still. The answer, it seemed, had never been as simple as they'd imagined. As Watson dipped his pen into ink and continued his account, a faint howl echoed in the distance, a soft whisper that only he could hear. And for a fleeting moment, the world seemed just a little bit darker, the moors forever holding their secrets.